The auction block felt like a cage. Eliza Moore stood tall, her hands folded tight in front of her, but inside, her heart felt as if it were unraveling with every breath. The crowd shifted, murmurs running through the sea of men who barely noticed her standing there, their eyes more interested in the dusty road than the woman whose fate lay in their hands. Her life, her worth, it was all being weighed in silence. The auctioneer's voice boomed, cutting through the tension, but no bids followed. Not one, just the soft shuffle of boots and the occasional clearing of throats. "Do I have any bids?" the auctioneer called, forcing a cheer into his voice. Silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Her stomach tightened as the crowd shifted again, waiting for the hammer to fall. The whisper of boots on wood was the only sound. Then, $5. A low, cruel voice called from the back of the crowd. Laughter followed, cutting through her like a knife. Eliza's throat constricted, but she refused to look down. She had nothing left. No family, no future, no reason to feel anything but the cold, brutal truth of what was happening. But she wouldn't beg. Not now. Not ever again. The auctioneer raised the hammer, his voice a mockery of enthusiasm. Going once, going twice. Wait. The word came sharp, loud, clear. It sliced through the tension like a blade, and every head turned toward the source. Eliza's gaze locked on a tall figure standing beneath the awning of the general store, half shrouded in shadow. His hat pulled low, his shoulders broad, his face hidden behind a weathered mask of indifference, but his eyes, pale, unreadable, were fixed on her, unflinching. "I'll take her home," he said, his voice low but firm, certain. His words were the kind that demanded attention without ever needing to raise their volume. The crowd went still. Even the saloon man, who had made the bid, stiffened. Eliza couldn't read the man's face, but a ripple of discomfort passed through him. The auctioneer faltered, glancing between the man and Eliza, clearly unsure. $10, the stranger repeated. "I'll pay 10, quote. The saloon man cursed under his breath, stepping back as the auctioneer nodded, the hammer falling with finality. Sold. The stranger stepped forward, his boots heavy on the wooden platform, his movements deliberate. He counted out the silver coins, each one echoing louder than the last, his gaze never leaving Eliza. "Burn the contract," he said, his tone almost detached, as if it was nothing more than a simple order. "I'm not buying a person. I'm offering work, fair pay, and a roof. She leaves when she wants." The auctioneer hesitated, eyes darting between the coins and the man, before he finally took the money and stepped back. The silence in the air thickened again, but now it held something different. A strange sort of tension, a thread of uncertainty that pulled tighter with every second. The man looked up at Eliza then, his expression unreadable. "Can you ride?" Her throat tightened again, the question simple but weighted. The hand that had been folded in front of her reached out, and with it, a soft tremor she couldn't control. She swallowed, gathering the courage to speak. "Yes." He nodded and offered his hand. Caleb Harlon. She didn't know why she said it, but the name slipped out of her mouth as she took it. His grip was firm, but careful. He helped her down from the platform and released her immediately, stepping back as though distance mattered more than anything else. There was something about the way he held himself, older than she expected, mid-30s at least, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of more than just age. He carried a quiet weariness with him that she couldn't place. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling despite her effort. His gaze shifted for a moment, but his expression didn't change. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "My place is an hour's ride. It's rough. The work's harder. If you're looking for easy, you won't find it there. My idea of easy died a long time ago." She lifted her chin, steadying herself. "I can work." A flicker of something crossed his face, a brief recognition, but it was gone before she could make sense of it. Without another word, they left Red Willow Crossing behind, the town shrinking in the distance as they rode out. Caleb's dun horse carried them both with steady, practiced ease. Eliza held her carpet bag with one hand, the other gripping his shoulder as they rode in silence. The landscape stretched wide around them, sagebrush and dust sweeping under the setting sun. Caleb didn't speak, and neither did she. There was nothing left to say, not yet. The valley ahead seemed to stretch on forever. The mountains rose in the distance, cloaked in shadows. The air, already cooling, brought with it a weight of impending rain. When the first drop of water fell from the sky, Caleb simply shrugged off his jacket and passed it back to her without a word. "You'll need it," he said simply. Eliza slipped the coat over her shoulders. It was heavy, smelling of leather and smoke. For the first time in a long while, she felt something inside her loosen. The storm rolled in quickly after that, the wind howling through the land, the sky darkening. The valley seemed to swallow them whole, leaving only the steady rhythm of hooves in the thundering sky above. After what felt like hours, Caleb broke the silence. "Why did you do it?" Eliza asked, her voice softer now, almost hesitant. "Bid on me." Caleb's shoulders stiffened, his eyes forward, scanning the land ahead. "I needed help around the place," he said simply. Eliza didn't fully believe him, but she let it rest. There were things unsaid between them, things neither of them could put into words. For now, that would have to be enough. The land ahead seemed endless, the world shifting around them as they rode into a future neither could predict. But for the first time in weeks, Eliza felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel, the barest thread of hope. They rode through the night, the landscape shifting beneath them as the mountains grew nearer. The chill in the air deepened, and Eliza pulled the jacket tighter around her shoulders, feeling the weight of the silence between them. Caleb's steady presence beside her was reassuring, but something still nagged at her, like an unanswered question she was afraid to ask. The moon hung low, casting a pale light over the rugged land. The wind picked up, cutting through the pines, but Caleb didn't seem bothered by it. His eyes stayed focused ahead, his movements smooth, controlled. Eliza, however, found herself clenching the reins tighter with every gust of wind, every turn of the trail. By the time they reached the ranch, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon, casting a soft glow over the land. The rain had stopped, but the air still felt heavy with the storm's remnants. Caleb led them up a narrow trail that wound around a cluster of pine trees, then down into a small hollow. There, nestled against the slope, was the cabin. It was small, but sturdy, a low log structure with smoke curling from the chimney. A barn stood nearby, weathered but sound, with horses poking their heads out from the stalls. The place was quiet, save for the soft rustle of the trees and the occasional neigh of a horse. For a moment Eliza felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, despite everything that had brought her here. "This is home," Caleb said, his voice quieter than usual. Eliza didn't speak right away. She took in the cabin, the land, and for the first time in weeks she felt something that almost resembled safety. It wasn't much, but it was hers now. A place to breathe. "It's beautiful," she said softly, the words coming more naturally than she expected. He dismounted first and then helped her down. His hands were gentle at her waist, his grip firm but careful, as though she were something fragile. She caught a glimpse of his face. The lines around his eyes were deeper than she had realized, the weariness there more than just a result of age. There was a hardness in him, a burden that Eliza couldn't yet understand. "Go inside," he said, stepping back. "I'll tend to the animals." Eliza nodded and watched him disappear into the barn before stepping inside the cabin. It was sparse but clean. A single bed, a small table, and a stone fireplace were the only furnishings. There were no decorations, no signs of personal warmth. But the place felt lived in, steady, grounded. She walked to the fireplace and started a fire, the crackling warmth filling the room as she worked her hands against the chill. Outside, Caleb moved through the rain and wind, his figure framed against the darkness, steady and sure. Eliza watched him for a moment, the silence between them settling like dust. There was no warmth in his gestures, but there was something undeniably real about him. Something unspoken that tugged at her. She turned away, lost in her own thoughts. as the fire grew stronger. When Caleb finally came inside, dripping wet from the storm, he paused at the sight of her by the fire. There was a flicker in his eyes, something he couldn't hide, but it was gone in an instant. He shook off his jacket and set it by the fire to dry. "You found the matches?" he asked, his voice sounding different now, softer, almost unsure. "Yes," Eliza replied, her voice steady despite the uncertainty that had settled in her chest. Caleb nodded once, then spoke again, but his words felt less certain this time. "You can have the bed," he said. "I'll sleep in the barn." Eliza shook her head quickly. "No, we'll make do," she said firmly, a hint of something rebellious in her voice. Caleb studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally he nodded, though the weariness in his eyes hadn't faded. "All right," he said softly, "but we keep it decent." Eliza nodded in return, her resolve hardening. She wasn't here to take charity. Not from him, not from anyone. They would make do, together, until she found her own way. But for now, the only thing she could offer was her strength. The rest would have to wait. The night passed slowly. Eliza slept fitfully, the wind howling outside, and the storm still rattling the walls of the cabin. She lay beneath the thin quilt, her body aching from the journey, but it was the memories that kept her awake. She thought of the auction block, of the cruel laughter, of the men who had stared at her like she was a piece of meat. And then she thought of Caleb, the man who had paid $10 for her freedom. No strings, no promises, just work and a roof. She wasn't sure what to make of him. There was something about him that felt like a lifeline, and yet she couldn't bring herself to trust it. Not yet. At dawn, she woke to silence. For a moment, she panicked, thinking Caleb had left her. But then, the scent of coffee filled the air, and she realized he was still there. She rose slowly, unsure of what to do next. But when she stepped into the main room, she saw Caleb moving quietly around the cabin. His boots soft against the floor, his movements practiced, as though he had done this 1,000 times before. He didn't speak at first, but when he noticed she was awake, he simply set a tin cup of coffee on the table and went about his business. "I'll be checking the fence line," he said quietly, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Storm may have brought down trees. I'll be back by noon." Eliza stood there for a moment, the cup of coffee in her hands, the warmth spreading through her fingers. She didn't know what she expected. Some sort of farewell, perhaps, or even a promise that things would be different. But Caleb simply left, without a word, without looking back. She took a long sip of the coffee, the bitterness grounding her. It was strange, this feeling of being left alone, yet not abandoned. She was still a guest in his world, still a stranger to him, but she had no choice but to trust the path ahead. The cabin was quiet once more. She rolled up her sleeves, preparing for the work ahead. She didn't know what her future here held, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't running anymore. The land outside the cabin felt vast, untouched, and silent. But inside, it was different. It was still too, but not in the way of empty places. There was a quiet strength here, a kind of peace that settled into Eliza's bones the longer she stayed. Caleb's cabin wasn't much to look at. A small log house tucked in a hollow, a smokehouse, and a barn with a sagging roof that seemed to hold its breath against the weight of the world. The work was harder than Eliza had imagined, but she hadn't expected anything else. The wind blew cold through the trees, and the air always seemed just a little bit too thin. The chores Caleb gave her were simple but exhausting: mending clothes, gathering firewood, tending to the animals when he couldn't. She did it without question, the rhythm of hard work grounding her, and in that rhythm she found a strange kind of comfort. The first night, she slept poorly. The wind outside rattled the windows, and every crack of thunder sent her heart into her throat, pulling her back to the auction block, to the laughter and the cruel silence. She lay still beneath the thin quilt, listening to Caleb's quiet movements on the other side of the makeshift curtain he'd rigged up. His presence was constant, a reassurance, yet it made her feel oddly disconnected, like she was drifting in a strange sea with no anchor. By morning, Caleb had already gone. She woke to the scent of coffee, the soft, rhythmic sound of boots moving on the cabin floor. She heard him before she saw him. His movements were quiet, deliberate. When he noticed she was awake, he didn't say anything. He just set a tin cup of coffee on the table before turning to leave. "I'm checking the fence line," he said, voice calm and steady. "Storm may have knocked some trees down. I'll be back by noon." Eliza sat at the table, the cup still warm beneath her hands, and watched him leave without a glance. The door shut softly behind him, leaving her alone in the stillness of the cabin. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The house was as simple as the man who lived in it, clean, neat, but bare. Dust sat in the corners, tools abandoned where he had last used them, as though life had no room for comfort here. She rolled up her sleeves and set to work. By the time Caleb returned, the floor had been swept, the dishes washed, and the pantry organized. Eliza had even found a half-sprouted potato and set it in a tin by the window, pressing soil around it like a promise. When Caleb saw her work, he said nothing at first. His eyes moved slowly over the cabin, taking in the change, the small signs of life that hadn't been here when he left. Finally, he spoke. "You didn't have to do this." Eliza met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "I know," she said, "but sitting still makes me think. And thinking hasn't been kind to me lately." Caleb's jaw tightened, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, he nodded. "Dinner's on the stove," she said. "I'm not a cook, but I know how to feed myself." He smiled faintly at that. It was the first time Eliza had seen anything close to warmth in his eyes. A moment of lightness, if only for a second. That night, they sat at the small table, eating in silence. The fire crackled between them, its warmth filling the space, but there was a tension in the air, thick and heavy. They both felt it, yet neither of them spoke it aloud. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm. Caleb worked the land, mended fences, and rode out for supplies. Eliza learned the small ways of the ranch, the patterns of the animals, and the hidden places where the creek ran deep enough for the cattle to drink. She did what she could, her body aching at the end of each day, but she never once complained. She wasn't sure why she didn't, but something about Caleb's quiet intensity, his willingness to work hard without ever asking for help, made her feel like complaining was a luxury neither of them could afford. By the time the weather had turned cold again, a silent understanding had settled between them. Caleb never asked her to stay, but neither did he ask her to leave. He simply did the work, and she followed. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something else, something that, for the first time in a long time, felt like hope. But then came the night. The storm broke. It started slowly, a steady patter of rain on the roof, but by the time Caleb returned from the barn, it had turned into a downpour. The sky had opened up, releasing torrents of water into the valley below. Eliza had just finished preparing dinner when she heard Caleb's boots dragging in the mud outside the door. He entered, shaking off the wet, his face grim, his eyes locked on hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The storm outside raged, but inside the cabin, it was just them. Two people caught in the middle of something they couldn't yet name. "It's a bad one," Caleb said, breaking the silence. "I'll need to check the fence line again tomorrow. If it keeps up like this, we'll lose the stock." Eliza nodded, feeling the weight of the storm settle in her chest. She didn't ask what he planned to do. He didn't need to say it aloud. They would survive. Somehow. Together. "I'll help," she said quietly. Caleb didn't answer at first. He simply removed his jacket, hanging it by the door. When he finally spoke, it was with the same steady tone he always used. "It's hard work," he said. "Not everyone can do it." "I know," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "But I can. I'll stay." Quote. Caleb's gaze flickered over her face for a moment before he turned away, gathering the firewood for the stove. He didn't say anything more, but Eliza saw something in his eyes, something that said for the first time that he believed her. And for the first time in a long while, Eliza believed it too. The days that followed were colder, the wind a constant whisper through the trees, as if the valley itself was keeping secrets. Eliza's muscles ached from the constant work, but each ache was a reminder. She was still here, still breathing, still fighting. Caleb had a quiet way of making things feel like they mattered. His movements were slow, deliberate, and while he didn't speak much, every action spoke louder than words ever could. When he saw Eliza struggling, he would simply step in and help without hesitation, his presence like a rock she could anchor herself to. But it wasn't just the work that kept her here, it was the way he made the silence between them feel comfortable. As if they were both waiting for something, but neither of them were sure what. That morning, when Caleb set out to check the fence line again, the snow was falling heavily, the air sharp and biting. He hadn't said much when he left, only that the snow would make the ride harder. The north fence always leaned, and with the storm, it might be worse. Eliza watched him leave through the window, his figure swallowed by the white landscape, his horse moving slowly through the thickening snow. She had grown used to these quiet mornings, the rhythmic sounds of Caleb's work, the way he moved through the land as if it were an extension of his own body. But there was something about today, a stillness that settled in her chest, a sense that something was about to change. She couldn't explain it, but it gnawed at her, a quiet, persistent tug of unease. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and stood up, deciding to do what she could. It wasn't much, but it was something to keep her busy. Eliza spent the morning sweeping the cabin, folding blankets, and making sure the fire stayed warm. The rhythmic movements kept her grounded, her thoughts steady. She didn't want to feel what she felt, a mix of uncertainty and something else, something deeper. Around noon, the sound of hooves reached her ears. She looked up, startled. It wasn't Caleb's familiar rhythm. This was fast, heavy, and too many horses to be just one. Her heart raced as she moved toward the window. Outside, 3 riders came into view, their forms appearing and disappearing through the snowfall. The lead rider was tall, dressed in fine leather, and there was something about his presence that sent a chill through her, despite the warmth of the cabin. She stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. Caleb's warning echoed in her mind. This land isn't for sale. The riders were closing in, and instinct told her it wasn't just a casual visit. Something was wrong. Eliza hurried to the door, her hand shaking as she reached for the latch. She had no weapon, no way of defending herself. But as the door creaked open, she saw Caleb coming from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth, his stance alert. He didn't reach for his rifle. His body shifted as though bracing for something, his movements deliberate, calculated. The lead rider swung down from his horse with ease, his boots crunching against the snow. He had a confident air about him, a man used to getting what he wanted. His eyes slid past Caleb to Eliza, lingering too long, too disrespectful. "Caleb Harlon," the man said, his voice smooth, almost casual. "Name's Vance Keller. I run cattle east of here." Eliza stayed where she was, spine straight, her hands clenched at her sides. "State your business." Caleb replied, his tone steady, not one to show weakness. Keller smiled, but there was nothing warm in it. "I heard you picked up a woman in town," he said, his eyes narrowing as they drifted back to Eliza. "Thought I'd welcome her to the valley." Eliza's skin prickled under his gaze, but she didn't speak. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of her discomfort. "I don't need welcoming," she said evenly, her voice as calm as she could make it. Keller's smile faded, and his gaze lingered on her, calculating. "Everyone does eventually," he said, voice dripping with a false sweetness. Caleb stepped forward, his presence suddenly commanding. There was no hesitation in his movements, no shift in his stance. He was unwavering. "You've welcomed us." "Now you can leave," he said, his voice a low growl, a warning that was as much a promise. Keller's men shifted in their saddles, their hands hovering near their guns. Keller raised a hand, but it wasn't to calm anyone. It was to show his power, his control. "Easy," Keller said, a mock placating tone in his voice. "No need for tempers. I'm just saying a man alone on land like this could use some friends. Especially with winter coming. Accidents happen." The threat was quiet, but unmistakable. "This land isn't for sale. Caleb repeated, his jaw tight, his eyes colder than the wind that bit at them. Keller chuckled, the sound hollow and dangerous. Everything's for sale. Some folks just don't know it yet. His gaze flickered back to Eliza. You sure you're here by choice, miss? I am, Eliza said, standing tall, refusing to show any sign of fear. And I stay by choice. For a moment, something flickered across Keller's face, sharp and calculating, but then it was gone, replaced by a polite nod. Think on what I said, Harlon, he muttered, before turning back to his men. This valley's hard on stubborn men. They mounted their horses and rode off, their figures swallowed by the snowstorm. The air felt too still once they were gone, like the calm before a storm. Caleb didn't say anything right away. His eyes were fixed on the spot where Keller and his men had disappeared. Who was that? Eliza asked, her voice steady but edged with concern. Trouble, Caleb said simply. The kind that doesn't go away. Later that night, as the wind howled outside, Caleb checked the rifle twice, his hands steady and practiced. Eliza noticed but didn't comment. The tension between them was thick, unsaid, hanging in the air. If it gets worse, she said quietly, I can leave. Caleb's gaze softened, but only for a moment. I don't want you to, he replied, his voice quieter than usual. I won't leave, Eliza said, her voice firm. Not now, not ever. The fire crackled between them, the warmth of it contrasting sharply with the cold silence in the room. Caleb reached for her hand, and this time, he didn't let go. Outside, the storm intensified, the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. But inside, there was a strange sense of calm settling over them both. They hadn't spoken of love, hadn't named what had begun between them, but it was there, fragile, yet unyielding. The storm had come, but they would face it together. The storm raged for days, each gust of wind pulling at the cabin, pressing against the walls like the land itself wanted to break through. The valley seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something, anything, to change. Eliza spent her time in the cabin, keeping the fire going, tending to the small tasks Caleb had left for her. The work kept her hands busy, her mind steady. But the stillness, the quiet tension between them, was harder to ignore as the days passed. It wasn't just the storm that had changed things. Something had shifted between her and Caleb, something she couldn't quite name. The fragile understanding between them had deepened. They had become something more than just two people sharing a space. It was unspoken, but both of them felt it. A bond that had grown out of necessity, yes, but also something that felt like it was growing into something more. Something that both of them were afraid to acknowledge. And then came the knock. It was mid-morning when Eliza heard it, hard and deliberate, like someone had been waiting for it. The sound sent a chill through her, and she froze, her breath catching in her throat. The horses in the corral snorted, their heads lifting in alarm. She moved quickly to the window. 3 riders were approaching, but this time it wasn't the snow or the wind that filled her with dread. It was the familiarity of the men riding into view, men she didn't want to see again. Vance Keller. His presence alone was enough to make her stomach twist. She watched from the window as Caleb stepped outside, wiping his hands on a cloth, his movements slow but deliberate. He didn't reach for his rifle, but Eliza could see the tension in his body, the way he shifted his weight, preparing himself for whatever was coming. The lead rider, Keller, swung off his horse with the same confident air he'd carried the last time they'd met. His smile was tight, predatory, and his eyes slid immediately to Eliza, lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. Caleb Harlon, he said, his voice smooth, like a snake in the grass. Name's Vance Keller. I run cattle east of here. Eliza stayed where she was, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure if Caleb had seen her face freeze, but he didn't look at her. He simply met Keller's gaze, steady and unwavering. What do you want? Caleb asked, his voice calm but edged with warning. Keller's eyes flicked over to Eliza, his gaze lingering far too long before he turned back to Caleb. I thought I'd pay a visit, Keller said, his tone dripping with false politeness. Thought I'd welcome your woman to the valley. Eliza stiffened, the words cutting through her like a blade. She wouldn't let him see the effect it had on her. Not again. I don't need welcoming, she said, stepping forward to stand beside Caleb, her voice steady. I'm here by choice. Keller smirked, the edge of malice in his smile making her stomach churn. Everyone does eventually, he said. His eyes flickered to Caleb then, the underlying threat in his words clear. Caleb didn't flinch. He stepped closer, his body tense with quiet power. The space between him and Keller closed with a few deliberate movements. You've welcomed us. Now you can leave, Caleb said quietly, but his voice was low and filled with something more than just anger. It was a promise. Keller's smile faded, his face darkening with fury. He motioned for his men to stay back, but there was still a tension in the air, something that crackled with the threat of violence. Eliza could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, but she didn't back away. I came to offer you something, Keller said, his voice dripping with venom. I've got land to the east. I've got water rights, cattle. You can join me, share in it, or we can continue to do things the hard way. Caleb didn't answer right away. He simply stared at Keller, his gaze unwavering. This land is ours, Caleb said, his voice colder now, the weight of every word hitting with a finality that seemed to settle over everything. Keller's men shifted again, uneasy but watching. There was no more talk of offers or land. The tension had shifted. The threat was no longer veiled. Your land, huh? Keller said with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. We'll see about that. Before either of them could say anything else, Keller turned, motioning for his men to follow him. The horses shifted, their hooves stirring the snow, and the men rode off into the distance without another word. But Eliza could see the look in Caleb's eyes, the sharpness that hadn't been there before. They'll be back, she said, her voice soft but sure. Caleb didn't answer right away. He stood still, watching as the riders disappeared into the distance, and when he finally turned back to her, his eyes were filled with something, not fear, but something more familiar. Then we'll be ready, he said simply. The rest of the day passed quietly. The snow had softened, the storm having moved on, but the air was thick with something else. The feeling of a threat that had yet to be fully realized. Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that the valley, for all its quiet, was no longer a safe place. That night, Caleb checked the rifle twice before setting it by the door. The silence that filled the cabin wasn't the same as before. It was heavier now, the weight of what had happened sitting between them like a stone. I won't let him take this place, Caleb said, his voice low. Eliza nodded, her hands wrapped around the warmth of her mug, her eyes steady on his. I don't think you will. They sat in silence for a long time after that. The wind howled outside, but inside, the crackling fire seemed to hold everything at bay. Caleb's presence, quiet and unyielding, gave her the strength she needed, and for the first time in days, she felt something other than fear, determination. The next day, Caleb woke early, and Eliza joined him in the work. They didn't speak much, but their actions, their focus on the task at hand, were all the conversation they needed. There was no doubt now, the land they had fought for, the life they had started to build was under threat, but they would face it together, as they always had. And whatever came next, Eliza knew this. They would hold their ground. The days that followed were quieter, but the tension still lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. Caleb worked the land with his usual steadiness, but now there was an urgency to every movement, a quiet readiness. Eliza, too, settled into the rhythm of their lives, the work that had once felt like a distraction, now a necessity, a way to keep her mind from straying too far. But in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the memory of Keller and his men, the threat they posed, the words left hanging in the cold air. She knew it wasn't over. It wasn't ever going to be. The valley had changed. The whisper of Keller's name had started to settle into every corner of the land, carried by the men who had once kept their distance, now talking in hushed tones. Some supported them, some didn't. Eliza couldn't help but notice how the eyes of the neighbors flickered toward her whenever she passed, how their whispers followed her like a shadow. Caleb noticed it too, but he said nothing. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke louder than any argument. He worked harder, rode out more often, checking the fence lines, making sure every corner of the land was secure. He wasn't just protecting the land, he was protecting her too. And Eliza wasn't blind to that. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Caleb stood outside, his back to the cabin, his face shadowed by the weight of the world. Eliza watched him from the window, the same thought running through her mind. It had been days since Keller had last been in the valley, but the quiet before the storm always felt more dangerous than the storm itself. She stepped outside, her breath catching in the cold evening air. Caleb didn't turn when she approached, but he knew she was there. "You're quiet tonight," she said, her voice soft. Caleb didn't answer right away. He just stood there, looking out over the land, his posture tense. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "I don't know how much longer this can last," he said quietly. "I've done everything I can to keep the peace, but Keller, he won't stop." Eliza stepped closer, her feet silent on the cold ground. "We'll make him stop," she said, her voice firm. Caleb looked at her then, his gaze steady, searching her face like he was looking for something. "I'm not afraid of him," he said, but there was something in his eyes, something he hadn't shared with her yet. "You should be," Eliza replied, her words sharper than she intended. "He'll come for you, Caleb, for both of us." He didn't answer, but Eliza could see the shift in him, the weight of the burden he was carrying, the guilt of not being able to protect them from what was coming. It wasn't the land he feared losing. It was her. "I'm not leaving," she said, the words coming from somewhere deep inside her. "This is our home. It's not just land. It's everything, and I won't let Keller take it from us." Caleb didn't respond, but he reached out then, his hand catching hers. His grip was firm, but it wasn't just about the strength. It was the connection between them, the understanding that had grown between them, something neither of them had ever expected, but something neither could deny. "I won't lose you," he said softly. Eliza felt a lump form in her throat, but she swallowed it down. "You won't," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "I'm not going anywhere." They stood together, in the fading light, their hands still clasped. The world around them was quiet, the sound of the wind, the only thing breaking the stillness. It was the kind of silence that felt like the calm before the storm, a silence that wouldn't last much longer. The next morning, Caleb left before dawn. Eliza had been awake for hours, watching the sky change from dark to light, her thoughts swirling. She knew the day ahead would be harder than any before. Keller wouldn't stop, not until he had what he wanted. She had to be ready. By noon, Caleb was back, his face grim, his movements sharp. He didn't speak immediately, but Eliza could see it in his eyes. He had found something that was going to change everything. "They're coming," he said simply, his voice low but steady. Eliza's heart skipped a beat. "How soon?" "Tonight," he replied. "We'll be ready. I need you to stay inside. Keep the rifle close." Eliza nodded, but she didn't need to be told. She had always known that whatever was coming, it was something they would face together. The afternoon passed in a blur of preparation. Caleb worked, moving quickly, securing the barn, checking the fences, making sure everything was in place. Eliza helped where she could, her hands moving on autopilot, her mind too focused on what was coming. When the sun set, the valley seemed to fall silent, as if holding its breath. Caleb stood outside the cabin, watching the horizon, his rifle in hand. Eliza stood beside him, her own rifle steady in her grip. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the smell of rain and the faintest hint of smoke. They didn't speak. There was no need to. The storm was coming, and they both knew it. By midnight, the riders arrived. They were as silent as the night, moving like shadows across the land. Eliza's pulse raced in her chest, but she kept herself steady, her eyes on Caleb, who was already in position. He didn't look at her, but she knew he was waiting for the right moment, the right signal. The riders didn't make it far. Caleb fired the first shot, a warning. It echoed through the valley, sharp and clear. The riders jerked in response, scrambling to cover, but Caleb had already moved, his movements quick and precise. Eliza followed his lead, firing once, twice, the sound of the rifle in her hands oddly comforting. The fight was short, the outcome inevitable. Keller's men had underestimated them, and they paid for it. By dawn, they were gone, leaving nothing behind but the smoke of their campfire and the echo of their failure. Eliza and Caleb stood together in the aftermath, the valley calm again. The storm had passed. They didn't speak about what had happened, but in that silence, something had shifted. A promise had been made, one that neither of them could ignore. In the days that followed, things began to change. The valley didn't feel as empty anymore. It felt full of the quiet strength they had both found in each other. The land, once a place of struggle, now felt like a home, a place that was theirs, built not from land or wealth, but from the love and trust that had been forged between them. And when they finally married, quietly, under the open sky, it was more than just a ceremony. It was a declaration that no matter what came, they would face it together, and that, in itself, was enough. The valley remembered them, remembered their fight, their strength, and the love that had grown in the face of everything that tried to tear them apart. And it was theirs.